All right, just before I forgot, let's first record it. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Landscape Live seminar. My name is Yue, and together with Annie, Lori, and Tamara, we'll be moderating today's session. Our session will typically run for about 1 hour with 30 to 45 minutes for the presentation, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. We will open the chat for questions as we are close to the end, and you are welcome to unmute yourself during the Q&A. Please note that the seminar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Now I'm very delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sinead Lyster. Sinead is a geoscientist working at the intersection between surface process, sedimentology, and stratigraphy. Basically everything about rivers, ancient and modern. She is interested in how surface process shapes the sedimentary records, and in turn, how we can use this record to understand landscape evolution. Sinead finished her PhD at Imperial College London and is now a postdoc researcher at Penn State University. Today, we'll hear from Sinead on her most recent work titled The Impacts of Vegetation on Delta Landscapes and Delta Stratigraphy, Insights from Physical Experiments. Please join me in welcoming Sinead.
Cool. Thank you for that introduction. So yeah, just check you can all see my cursor. And yes, cool. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about some of my work here at Penn State, which has been focused on physical delta experiments. Here you can just see some photos of my experimental vegetated delta, and you can see some vegetation on there. That's alfalfa, which is commonly used in experiments. And yeah, so today I'm going to talk about how I use these experiments to try and gain insights into the impacts of vegetation on delta landscapes and delta stratigraphy. Okay, deltas. So deltas are super morphologically diverse and dynamic landscapes, and vegetation directly impacts these landscapes. So vegetation impacts alluvial landscape evolution by altering flow conditions and providing sediment cohesion. And in turn, this promotes channelization, stable networks, and floodplain development. And here you can just see some examples of various non-vegetated or kind of partially or slightly vegetated deltas, and then fully vegetated deltas that we have on Earth today. And hopefully you can see that there are many differences between them in terms of the shape of their networks, the shapes of their shorelines, and so on. So what do we know about how vegetation impacts deltas? So now I'm just going to quickly kind of broaden a little bit and focus on how does vegetation impact channels and deltas. We know a lot about this, and we know a lot about it, particularly on short to intermediate timescales. So these timescales would be timescales associated with perhaps hours to decades to hundreds of years. And these might be timescales associated with individual discharge events, annual trends, decadal trends, but also kind of getting up to the longer end, the kind of like short-term sea level rise and delta building. And we know a lot about this, and we gain insights from a combination of theory and modeling, field observations, satellite imagery, experimental observations, and so on. Comparatively, when we think about vegetation impacts on channels and deltas on intermediate to long timescales, we don't know as much. So when I talk about intermediate to long timescales, I'm talking about kind of hundreds to thousands of years and above. And these would be timescales that are associated with more long-term sea level rise, delta building, but this time thinking of both progradation and aggradation, and then ultimately up to timescales associated with stratigraphic accumulation. And we don't know as much on these timescales, but we do know some things. And all of these insights have come from numerical models and kind of flume experiments, but on the shorter duration. So I'm interested in understanding how vegetation impacts deltas on those intermediate to long timescales. And I guess the next question is, why am I interested in this? So understanding these impacts on these longer timescales is really important for predicting landscape change. So thinking about how will deltas respond to vegetation change or vegetation decline? And these are changes that might arise as climate continues to change. How will vegetation impact delta response to sea level change? So we know sea level is rising, and it's already been observed that deltas across the globe are gaining/losing land. So how might vegetation impact how deltas adjust in response to sea level rise? Understanding these impacts on longer timescales is also important for decision making. So, as how will vegetation impact delta response to sediment supply increase or decrease? So, as we build and remove dams, how will downstream deltas respond? Will the presence or absence of vegetation impact this response? And this is just an example here um, from Warwick et al. And these are observations of the Elwha river mouth in the 5-6 years following the Elwha dam removal. And then also thinking about long-term kind of biogeochemical cycles and long-term carbon storage. How will vegetated deltas contribute to long-term floodplain carbon storage and carbon export to ocean sinks? And then I guess my third kind of key motivation is understanding vegetation impacts on these longer timescales. It's also really important for stratigraphic interpretation. So if I just pause for a second and ask you all to just sit there and think of a delta deposit, what does a delta deposit look like? My next question would then be, did you think of coal? So a lot of our best studied modern deltas, vegetated deltas, and a lot of our best studied delta deposits in the rock record are coal rich, which implies vegetation. So our delta facies models are often based on observations of vegetated deltas, or they assume vegetation was present. And this raises questions about our ability to interpret non-vegetated delta deposits in a stratigraphic record, perhaps deltas throughout pre-vegetation Earth history. So yeah, this brings me to the kind of next questions of why do we want to know this on those longer timescales? Answering questions such as how did pre-vegetation landscapes evolve? So Earth was unvegetated for 90% of its history, but when we focus on ancient landscape evolution, we most often focus on the recent 10%. So there's so much of alluvial landscape evolution that we haven't even observed. And really kind of gaining insights into vegetation impacts on those long timescales will help us to read that rock record. Also, this may help us for determining the origin of fan-shaped landforms on planetary surfaces. So a lot of researchers will look at fan-shaped deposits on Mars and other terrestrial planetary surfaces and try to decipher their origins. You know, were they deltas? Were they alluvial fans? Were they fluvial fans? And this often leverages observations of modern systems. So it's really important that we get a good constraint on how vegetated and non-vegetated systems behave and differ on those long time scales. So circling around to my exact research questions, I guess as you kind of mentioned, I very much work at the intersection of surface processes, sedimentology, and stratigraphy. And if you know me, you'll know that everything I do is sort of motivated by this kind of diagram. So I like to go and I like to make observations of surface processes, and then I like to see, okay, how are these surface processes translated to the stratigraphic record? Because if we do that, we can then go to the stratigraphic record and we can decipher what ancient surface processes look like. So this kind of underpins everything I do. And so my research questions are going to be, how does vegetation impact delta morphodynamics? So what's happening on the surface? How does vegetation impact delta sedimentation? So how are the processes and behaviors that we observe, how are they translated to the sedimentary record? And then finally, how does vegetation impact delta stratigraphy? Is there something distinct or characteristic about the stratigraphic architecture that we can use to then decipher what was happening on ancient planetary surfaces? So how am I going to do this? So as I mentioned, we know relatively less about vegetation impacts on deltas on those intermediate to long time scales. And what we do know largely comes from numerical modeling. However, we do also have insights that have come from physical experiments. And these experiments have focused on vegetation impacts on delta building, but at shorter kind of progradation related timescales. And some of these experiments get to the point where you kind of get to the aggradation point, but it's kind of, you set the intermediate timescale. So you're prograding, but we want to prograde and aggrade. When we think about progradation and aggradation, there's also been work by Kelly Sanks, who ran a series of experiments to both prograde and aggrade delta, but using a creolinite clay as a proxy for marsh deposits, marsh vegetation. So taking this, I decided, okay, I'm going to investigate vegetation impacts on deltas on these longer timescales, and I'm going to do it with physical experiments. But what I want to do is I want to use actual vegetation. So I want to prograde and I want to aggrade. This will allow me to accumulate deposits, build stratigraphy that I can then investigate. However, I wanted to do this with actual vegetation to try and capture those root effects. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that this has been done. Um, the, it may not be the first time that people have raised sea level with vegetation, but we're pretty sure it's the first time we've raised sea level with vegetation to the point that we're building stratigraphy and then slicing into it. And if you do know any work that has been done on this, please let me know because I would really like to compare the results. So yeah, just the disclaimer, it's a bit of a pilot study in how do we use vegetation when building experimental stratigraphy. But yeah, so I will now explain that. So first things first, we're taking the methods right all the way back because we didn't just start these experiments, we had to build the basin first. So this is a little bit of basin promo. So we have a new flume basin laboratory at Penn State University. My PI, Anastasia Poloris, this is her flume basin lab. And so we started with an empty basin and then we had some kind of vision. What do I want these experiments to look like? We then went to Home Depot and we spent an obscene amount of money. We went back and we did this over and over. So this is a very DIY basin. We built everything. So we built constant head tanks. We set up the entire plumbing situation so that we could recirculate water through the basin. Everything was very DIY, and I include it because I like it. I calibrated the constant head tank flow rates by using my nail polish to indicate each increment of flow rate. So yeah, this is a very DIY basin, but it's all fully functional. And then this is the result. And we call it the Delta Studio, mainly because the walls, the floors, the ceilings, everything is black. And so when you turn the lights on, it looks like a photography studio. So this is our Flume lab, the Delta Studio. And just to flag, so I ran the first experiments in this basin, but now we have a grad student, Ash Keenan, who is running the second set of experiments. And you can see a nice picture of that on the right-hand side. We joke that the blue and white is very Penn State colors. And because with all basins, we have to name the basin. The current working name is the Sandbox, which is the Sand and Natural Dynamics Basin for observational experiments. It may or may not stick. It may or may not stick, but this is what we're trying right now. So, okay, my experimental setup. We've taken that little schematic and now I have a diagram. So in my basin, I wanted to investigate the long-term impacts of vegetation on delta dynamics and delta stratigraphy. So I set up two deltas, so two experiments, and both experiments had the exact same setup, the exact same parameters. The only difference is that one included vegetation. And for that, we used alfalfa, which is very commonly used in physical experiments, mainly because of its fast germination time and the speed with which it can sprout and grow to of order a centimeter in height. So yeah, everything was the same and everything was constant. So we used a constant flow rate, we used a constant sediment transport rate, and we did these in a ratio where our sediment feed, our water to sediment ratio was 250 to 1. And for our sediment mixture, we had a mixture of fine sand, medium to coarse sand, and a bentonite clay. And so you can see here, so yeah, we have our constant head tanks. We're recirculating water on both sides. And then I mentioned that I wanted to build stratigraphy. So because we were recirculating water, we had no base level change. So we additionally pumped water in from an external reservoir at a rate that is equivalent to a sea level rise rate of 2.5 millimeters per hour. So everything's the exact same. We have a constant sea level rise rate of 2.5 millimeters per hour. And the only difference between the two deltas is that one has vegetation. So how did I run this experiment? So we ran the experiment in cycles. So just to show you what one experimental cycle looks like. So an experimental cycle was 4 hours of runtime, which you can see in here. So that's my sediment feed and that's my water feed. And then at the end of this 4 hours, we reseeded the vegetated delta and then we left it for a few days to germinate and grow. And these seeds were all pre-soaked re-soaked, ready to go when we distributed them across the delta. So that's what one cycle looks like. And we did this 15 times. So in total, we had 15 experimental cycles, which equated to 15 centimeters of sea level rise, building at least 15 centimeters of stratigraphy. And as I mentioned, because these were the first experiments to raise sea level with vegetation and try to build stratigraphy, we didn't really know how to go about this. Like how often do we need to reseed? What should our seeding density be? So this is a little bit of a pilot study. So if you're thinking about doing something like this in the future, please feel free to reach out and get my do's and don'ts. Many don'ts, but yeah. So this was the procedure that we did. And but just before I jump in and start showing you the time-lapse videos, I just want to briefly pause because we've gone from the very reasonably colored schematic diagram to very colorful photos. And I just want to quickly explain what these colors are and why we have them. So first, the color of the water. So in physical experiments, researchers will often dye the water, normally blue, so that when you're taking overhead photos, and those overhead photos where the data come from, we need a contrast so that we can apply image thresholding techniques to extract a channel mask, a land mask, a sea mask. So that's why we dye the water. Researchers often dye the water blue, but when you're working with vegetation, the blue and green can be too similar, so we dye the water red. And it just looks pink here because there's a sediment platform at the base. Now, for the sediment, you'll notice that there's orange sediment and blue sediment. So I mentioned that I was interested in building stratigraphy and having a look at what these deposits look like, but that's going to be really difficult if everything is just kind of clean white sand. So I have this fine sand fraction and I have this coarser sand fraction. So what we did was we replaced a small fraction of each with a colored sand that we could use to help map the deposits. So when you see orange, I want you to think of channels, channel processes, channel dynamics. And when you see blue, I want you to think of overbank deposition, lobe deposition, that kind of thing. So I will now dive straight into the videos. These are time-lapse videos. So if you look on the left to begin with, this is our non-vegetated delta. Remember, orange is channel, blue is kind of overbank or towards the edges bars. And so hopefully you can see that there's a lot of movement. Channels are moving across the delta. You have these kind of small channels fanning out from the apex, and then you have a longer channel building a lobe that swings around. And you'll notice this swings back and forth through time. Whereas when you look at the vegetated delta, you'll find that it's pretty much just quite a fixed channel network. So we have this big dominant channel here, and we have lots of channels coming off. Sometimes they get abandoned, sometimes they get reoccupied, and you might see kind of switching between the two halves of the delta. So kind of a lot of the results, we can just see this from the videos themselves. But I'll let this finish and then I'll show you what we then did. So while these experiments were running, we were taking overhead photos, the photos from which this time-lapse are made. And so now just to show you how we went and analyzed those. So from those overhead photos, we used image thresholding and segmenting methods to generate binary masks of key delta features. So we're leveraging those colors to kind of segment different parts of the image, separating land and sea, separating channel from overbank. And so we did one photo equating to one mask per minute. And this was a 60-hour experiment. So it was 60 hours, it's 15 cycles with 4 hours of runtime each cycle. So that got us to 3,600 photos and 3,600 masks. So just as an example, so we can take these photos and we can generate masks of the shoreline, so separating delta land from sea. We can also extract a shoreline contour, which we might use to analyze shoreline roughness. We can extract channel networks, which we might use to investigate processes of channel mobility. And we might also extract the vegetation and start to think about how is vegetation being turned over during these experiments. Now, to go through the results, I'm kind of going to jump between methods and results a little bit, just to try and kind of follow a story. I don't want to front load you with all these kind of metrics and things that we try to calculate because you'll have to just cling on to that information for too long. So just to kind of very first result, we're just going to look at how delta area changed through the experiment. And I just want to set up this plot because this format of plot is going to be quite regular in this presentation. So on the x-axis here, we have the experimental hour. So hour 1 to hour 60. And as I mentioned, we have 15 cycles. Each cycle is 4 hours. So each x-axis label represents the start and finish of an experiment cycle. And for most of these plots, I show the trend for the non-vegetated delta, which will be in orange, and then the vegetated delta, which will be in green. So this is just a plot of delta area, delta top set area throughout the experiment duration. And I don't want to extrapolate too much from this just because this is first order insight. There's still some work to do with the delta areas, pulling in the kind of slope data. I need to tidy up some of these masks. Ignore that little bump there. That should be more like this. That's just a mask making artifact. But just kind of, if we just take our delta areas and look at them through the experiment duration, you might notice that for the non-vegetated delta, we have a faster area loss as sea level rise began, but then we reach a kind of stable delta area that aggrades in conjunction with sea level rise by about halfway through the experiment. Whereas when we look at the vegetated delta, it loses area more slowly throughout the experiment in a more linear-like fashion. And perhaps this is due to more efficient delivery of sediment to shorelines, to those low-lying regions. And for this delta, we find that the stable delta area that aggrades in conjunction with sea level rise, we're achieving that by kind of hour 40 and beyond. So yeah, don't want to say anything too conclusive yet. There are potential insights into how vegetation may potentially slow land loss as sea level rises, but there's more work that I need to do from this. But now I'm going to show you how we might go about and analyze channel mobility and floodplain residence. So I'm just going to use an example here of channel visitation frequency and show you how I might calculate that. So we're just going to take the photo of our delta and we're going to generate our channel network mask. So in this mask, all these channel pixels are ones and these non-channel pixels are zeros. And you can imagine these pixels as a grid that looks something like this. So each pixel has a value of a 1 or a 0. Now what we can do is for every single mask that we've generated through the experiment, we can iterate through these masks and for a single pixel, we can check, is it a 1, is it a 0? And we can do this for every time step throughout the experiment, all the way from 0 to 3,600. And then, so once we've done that, so we've effectively stacked all of these masks, calculated how often a pixel was active, and then we can make a heat map. So this, as an example, would be a channel visitation frequency heat map. So here you would be looking at kind of like the brighter colors. Those would be regions that have higher channel visitation frequencies. So for more time steps during the experiment, these pixels were channel network. Now, this kind of approach, this kind of taking the masks, stacking them, tracking what pixels are doing throughout the experiment, we can calculate other metrics too, things like channel turnover frequency, channel persistence, and floodplain persistence. And then I'll show you some of those results. So for just gonna move this. So here we have, these are our channel visitation frequencies. So these are the results of the method that I just showed you. So here on the color bar, so we have channel visitation frequency. So that's the number of time steps that a pixel was active. It was active channel. And I'm just showing it as a percentage of the experiment duration. So here, like these bright pixels here, these pixels were active channel for probably 80–90% of the experiment. Whereas these pixels, these pink ones down here, these were probably active for only half the experiment or less. And so just to kind of start to look at these, hopefully you can see there are distinct differences between them. You can hopefully see that for the non-vegetated delta, flow is visiting a larger portion of the delta top set, and it's doing so in proximity to the delta apex. Whereas as you get further out towards the edges, we have lower visitation. Whereas for the vegetated delta, hopefully you can see that channel visitation is kind of restricted to a really fixed network. And then in between these kind of branches, in between these channels, we have lower visitation. Now, just to pull up some of the statistics, there we go. So here, if I just take, for every pixel that's channel, if I just plot the cumulative frequency of channel visitation frequency, again, orange is non-vegetated, green is vegetated. If you look at the cumulative frequencies here on the left y-axis, and then here are just the kind of frequencies percentage on the y-axis, on the right y-axis. And hopefully you see that the distributions are pretty similar. There are some slight differences, but overall, the mean is within a factor of 1.5. A bunch of that could be analytical, little mask making artifacts, which I need to tidy up. But yeah, broadly, we're seeing quite similar summary statistics and distributions. But when we look at those heat maps, we have very distinct spatial patterns. So that's quite interesting because we're really kind of getting insights into how vegetation is promoting that fixed network and keeping high channel visitation persistent throughout the experiment in this network. Now, the issue with this is if we're thinking about channel mobility, if we look at this here, it's kind of we know that channel visitation is high around this region, but what this heat map isn't telling us is this a kind of a little sheet flood that's just kind of fanning out? Or is it one little channel that's really quickly moving left and right? So that's information that we can't get from this metric. So now what we're going to do is we're going to think of other ways to probe that. And so to do this, we're going to calculate channel turnover frequency. And so this is inspired by what former PhD student Sophia Alpheus, now Dr. Alpheus, did during her PhD. So thinking of those masks that we stack, this time instead of calculating how often a pixel was active, we're going to calculate how often a pixel transitioned from wet to dry, dry to wet, wet to dry. And per pixel, we can count the number of those transitions. And perhaps that will give us insights into, was that a sheet flood that stayed there? Or was it channels that were moving around back and forth? And so now if you look at these heat maps, again, the color bar, so this is the channel turnover frequency. So the number of time steps that a pixel transition from wet to dry, just calculated as a percentage of the experiment duration. So out of those 3,600 time steps. And I want you to ignore this. This is a glare artifact. But broadly, when you look at the non-vegetated and vegetated deltas, you can hopefully see that for the non-vegetated delta, we have relatively high turnover happening in this proximal region. Whereas for the vegetated delta, we see kind of more localized turnover. And if you think back to that channel visitation frequency, you'll notice that the turnover is restricted. It's kind of focused on the edges of those channel networks. So again, pulling up the statistics, again, we see quite similar summary statistics and we see quite similar distributions. So really the distinction is coming at how these are distributed in space. Another metric that we might think about is how long these channels persist for. So again, thinking of our mask stack, if we now, if we're tracking how often a pixel goes from wet to dry, dry to wet, we can also track how long did a pixel stay wet for? How long did a pixel stay dry for? And this is similarly following what Sophia did during her PhD. So for each mask, I calculated what was the maximum length of time that a pixel stayed channel network. And you can see here, channel maximum persistence here, again, as a percentage of experiment duration. And hopefully you can see that here for the vegetated delta, maximum persistence is quite high for that very stable fixed channel network. Whereas for the non-vegetated delta, channel persistence is high in that proximal apex region. So that's telling us, we always had flow here and it was kind of swinging around. This separation, I think, is because we often had lobes on either half of the delta that kind of picked up and abandoned. But generally, you have high channel persistence in that proximal region, but low persistence in those outer regions. Whereas for the vegetated delta, it's persistent throughout the network. And again, statistics, similar means, similar medians, similar distributions. Now, just to kind of switch from thinking about channel visitation, channel turnover, channel persistence, we're now going to switch and start thinking about floodplain residence. So instead of tracking how often a pixel was channel, we're going to track how often a pixel wasn't channel. So how often was a pixel effectively a floodplain deposit? And so again, for the entire experiment, we tracked the durations the lengths of time that pixels were non-channels, so they were floodplain. And here we've basically plotted the maximum floodplain residence time for each delta. So here again, residence time as a percentage of the experiment duration. So for the non-vegetated delta, you can hopefully see that floodplain residence time is very low to almost non-existent in those proximal apex regions. But as you go towards the kind of distal portion of the top set, you have increased floodplain residence time. So that would be kind of the mouse bars that persist um, for a given amount of time. But then when you compare this to the vegetated delta overall has much higher floodplain residence times. And you can see that these high floodplain residence times are persistent in space. So in the kind of proximal regions near the apex, we have high floodplain residence times. But also in the kind of distal portions near the shoreline, we also have high floodplain residence times. So now when I pull out these statistics, these are a bit more dissimilar. So our summary statistics and our distributions that are similar, and also our spatial patterns are distinct. And just to highlight some of the numbers, so if we think about the median values, so those are denoted by these points here on the cumulative frequency distribution. So for our non-vegetated delta, the median floodplain residence was 7% of the experiment duration, whereas the vegetated, whereas the vegetated median floodplain residence time was 12%. So it's nearly 2 times greater for the vegetated delta. When we look at the means, which are down here, again, for the non-vegetated delta, the mean is about 10%, whereas for the vegetated delta, the mean is 20%. So the mean is also 2 times greater. If we start looking at things like the 75th percentile, for the non-vegetated delta, that's about 16%, and for the vegetated delta, it's 36%. So that's 2 times greater, if not more than 2 times greater. So we're consistently seeing that floodplain residence times are 2 times greater for the vegetated delta than the non-vegetated delta. And some of the next steps that I want to do is kind of look at how that is distributed in time, kind of compare the floodplain residence times in the kind of proximal regions and kind of branching out kind of in a contour-like fashion to tease that apart further. So next, we've covered kind of channel mobility, floodplain turnovers. So now we want to think about what do our shorelines look like? How might we analyze shoreline roughness and shoreline irregularity? So to do this, here's just an example again of a vegetated delta with the shoreline outlined. So one thing we can do is we can calculate the perimeter area ratio. And that's just, it's a measure of complexity that describes how regular or compact a shoreline is. And we calculate that by taking the length of the shoreline perimeter and dividing it by the area enclosed by the perimeter. And the next thing that we can do is we can also calculate the fractal dimension of the shoreline. So fractal dimensions, this is another measure of complexity. And for shorelines, it describes how the shoreline is filling space at different scales. So at smaller scales all the way up to larger scales. And to calculate this, we used a box counting method. So for a series of box sizes, we divide the mask into a grid of boxes and count the number of boxes that contain at least one shoreline pixel. So we do that for a series of box sizes. And then once we've done that, we take our box size and our box count and we fit a log regression to those box size and box counts. And from the slope of that line, we can extract the fractal dimension. Now, to show you some of the results, I just want to flag that prior to doing the shoreline roughness analysis, we did smooth the shoreline slightly. So we did a contour simplification that removed unnecessary points within a given threshold. And we did this within what would be a 0.5 centimeter area, just to remove any kind of small scale irregularities or noise that arise from the mask making process. And this is mainly trying to remove the effect of kind of, for the vegetated deltas, the shoreline masks would often wrap around individual alfalfa leaves. So we just simplified the contours within this small threshold just to remove any noise at that scale. So just to first show you the results of the perimeter area ratios. So here on the y-axis, we have perimeter area ratio, and the higher you are on this axis, the more irregular or less compact shoreline you have. And then here's the experimental duration. So hopefully you can see that over the entire experiment, the vegetated delta has higher perimeter area ratios. And you might also notice that these perimeter area ratios fluctuate. And when you compare those fluctuations to the non-vegetated delta, those fluctuations appear to have higher amplitudes and longer wavelengths. Now, there's a lot going on here. So we want to kind of zoom in and have a look at what is happening within an experiment cycle. So to do that, we generated these plots. So here, again, we have perimeter area ratio on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, we have minute within experimental cycles. So now we're just looking at one cycle, but we're looking at all 15. So for the non-vegetated delta, if it's a light yellow-orange color, that's cycle 1. And for increasingly dark colors, we're going through the cycles all the way up to cycle 15. Same for the vegetated delta, light green, cycle 1, all the way through up to cycle 15. Now, it's interesting because for both deltas, we see that perimeter area ratios increases across the experiment duration. So you can see that in this plot, you can see this overall increasing trend. And then when you split it up into experimental cycles, you can see that each kind of trend, we get progressively darker higher up. Now, why do we see this? So these increasing perimeter area ratios, is this a result of geomorphic memory? So the kind of cumulative impact of processes, events, conditions, or is this just an analytical result of that decreasing delta area through the experiment duration? So because of this, we wanted to kind of check, and this is what motivated us to look at the fractal dimensions of the shorelines. So now the fractal dimensions here, fractal dimension is on the y-axis. So when your fractal dimension is 1, you're looking at kind of a very straight, smooth line. Whereas as your fractal dimension increases, like all the way up to 2, that would be like fractal. So most shorelines, real shorelines, tend to have fractal dimensions of around like 1.1 to 1.3. The kind of super fractal shorelines can get even higher. But yeah, hopefully you can see that again across the experiment duration, for the vegetated delta, our fractal dimensions are overall higher. We do also see these fluctuations, and similar to previous, they seem to have higher amplitudes and potentially longer wavelengths. But this time, we don't see that increase across experiment duration. So that's kind of telling us that, okay, what we saw before, that's an analytical result of the decreasing area. So again, quickly zoom in, and we can see the same thing here. Now, something else that we can think about is, do changes in channel network area, vegetation area, and shoreline fractal dimensions, do they correlate with one another? So some of the things we've observed so far, how do they line up? So this is just a plot of vegetation area throughout the experiment. And here we have the vegetation area on the y-axis. And so here you can see quite nicely each reseeding cycle. So at the start of the experiment, we had very little vegetation. It wasn't very established. But with each reseeding cycle, we have this increase in vegetation. It declines through the cycle. We reseed, it declines through the cycle, and so on. But you can see quite nicely that we have this kind of overall increase in vegetation. And then we get to the point where the delta had too much vegetation. And it was difficult for the alfalfa to fruit and sprout. Now, one thing that we could do, and I just want to flag that this is something we're working on right now, is because we haven't really experimented with vegetation and sea level rise in experiments, one thing that we have the opportunity here to do is effectively break that 60-hour-long experiment into kind of the 15 cycles, those 15 mini experiments. So for each cycle, we have a unique set of conditions that we can use to potentially probe relationships between channel network area change, vegetation area change, and potentially any correlation with the shoreline roughness metrics. So for each of these, you can just see, so the green line, this is just for the vegetated delta. So x-axis is minute within a cycle, and then here we have the green line, that's our vegetation area. Blue line is our channel network area, and then the black line, and those are both the left y-axis, and they're as a percentage of the delta area. And then the right y-axis is our shoreline fractal dimension, which is the black line. So I only made this plot yesterday, but this is something that we're starting to think about now. Can we find any trends or correlations when we start looking at differences between cycles? So we've seen that vegetation impacts shoreline roughness. So our vegetated shorelines are overall rougher, but what is driving this? So just to try and visualize the shoreline change, I've just plotted for every single mask the frequency that a pixel was onshore, generating what may or may not be a sort of pseudo isopac map. So hopefully you can see here, we have a lot of lobe definition happening. And if you get your eye in, you can see everything here, things are smoother, more rounded, whereas here we have a lot more definition. And we can also visualize this by taking all of those shoreline contours and just stacking them on top of each other. And when you look at this, again, you can see that for the non-vegetated delta, these smoother, broader shorelines, you kind of see like lobes swinging around. Whereas for our vegetated delta, we have more enhanced lobe definition. And what we think is that this vegetated the vegetation, it's fixing the channel network, keeping a really stable channel network, such that water and sediment is routed straight past, building out lobes, but restricting lobe migration. So if we just have a look at the at the non-vegetated delta, here you can see these quite bulbous rounded lobes, and you see them at larger scales, but also when you zoom in at smaller scales. When we compare this to the vegetated delta, these lobes, they're more kind of the bird's foot type lobes. So just to highlight some of them there, so you could imagine water and sediment being rooted past, building out these little bird's foot like lobes with high definition. And you also see this definition at smaller scales. So just to kind of take some of those observations that we've made, so we notice stable channel networks with persistent floodplains, and then combining that with the shoreline roughness and the irregular shoreline evolution, we kind of get evidence for, these channel networks. We're routing water and sediment past, we're restricting lobe migration, which is enhancing lobe definition. And this is localizing offshore sedimentation. And that is kind of driving those shoreline changes that we see. But how does this translate to stratigraphy? That is what I briefly go through. So to go back to our experimental methods, so how do we observe experimental stratigraphy? So at the end of that experiment, we did a multi-step process to drain the basin, cover our deposits to protect them. We then mapped the sections. So we mapped arc sections going from proximal to distal, and then we sliced those sections. So for each delta, we took 8 sections going from proximal to distal. And then, okay, how will we analyze experimental stratigraphy? So for each of those sections, we took photos all the way around. And from these photos, some examples above, we used photogrammetry to generate both 3D models and then 2D orthomosaics of those sections. So taking something like this, which you can see, and generating something that looks like this. And remember, orange, channels, blue, overbank floodplain, lobe deposition. So once we've got these panels, we can start to do things like we can look at channel dimensions, channel trajectories within the stratigraphy. We might do something like this. So looking at kind of how a channel is persistent up through the section. But we can also start to map lobe deposits and look at the geometries of those lobe deposits. Now, I have only just started doing these analyses, so I'm not going to show you results. I'm just going to show you pictures of stratigraphy. So what does our stratigraphy look like? So for our non-vegetated delta stratigraphy, so here we have these 8 sections going from proximal to distal. And then for our vegetated delta, again, 8 sections going from proximal to distal. So if we zoom in and have a look at what this looks like, first, what does vegetated experimental stratigraphy look like? This is one of the most common questions that I'm asked because we had no idea what it was going to look like. We were a little bit worried that with using vegetation, we were worried about how it decomposes. We were thinking, oh no, is this a pile of roots and it's decomposed? And so the sediment isn't very compact. And as we cut into the delta, it's going to be rubbly and fall away. So we had no idea. So this is just an example of, so you can imagine me slicing the delta, pulling away blocks. And so here's a section here, and you can see on this kind of blue surface, this depositional surface, you can see bits of green in there. So that's kind of what the decomposed vegetation looked like. And just some more photos. So kind of higher up where it was less decomposed, it was still very green, little green patches. Further down, you can see these more little gray, dark patches. And then in the most compacted, kind of the lowermost areas, it was almost a sludge. I joke that I made coal. But yeah, so that's what it looks like. And it doesn't smell too bad. So just to kind of show you what some of these sections look like. So just to show you what some of the proximal sections look like. So here we have our non-vegetated stratigraphy, and this would be in one of those proximal sections, so right near the delta apex. And here's the same, but for the vegetated proximal deposits. And these black bars are just approximately 10 centimeters. So hopefully what you'll notice is that in the kind of proximal region, I mean, in general, a lot of these deposits, oh, I've lost my cursor. So a lot of these deposits are quite amalgamated. You can see these kind of, all these orange surfaces, and they're all kind of stacked up and merged. And there's little bits of floodplain in between. So for both non-vegetated and vegetated in this really proximal region, there's a lot about amalgamation, but you can start to get a sense here for this vegetated delta. There's some kind of clustering going on. So you see all this orange here, that's that kind of dominant channel network that kind of persisted through the experiment. And then all this here, this blue, but it's kind of blue mottled, that's like a vegetated overbank that also persisted for the majority of the experiment. And then here, again, you can see these channels that are clustered. So we're starting to see some channel clustering. Now, if we switch to kind of more medial deposits, again, so the black bar is approximately 10 centimeters. So here's some stratigraphy in the medial section for the non-vegetated delta and for the vegetated delta. So at this scale, so hopefully again, just thinking, keeping with on the clustering theme, here, if we look for those orange deposits, they're quite dispersed across the panel. And you can just see these kind of long, thin channels. They're just quite dispersed. Whereas again, when you look at the vegetated delta, we can see clustering, but here it's more pronounced. So we can really see this channel on the vegetated delta that just persisted for the majority of the experiment duration before abandoning and moving over here. And you can see that as it aggraded, it also migrated slightly. And we can see that in most of those medial sections. So we're seeing again that channel clustering, but also when we look at the channel bodies themselves, we can start to notice differences in how extensive those channel deposits are. So here for the non-vegetated delta, these orange channel deposits, they're more laterally extensive, suggesting that the role of lateral accretion is greater than vertical accretion. Whereas for our vegetated deposits, these channel deposits, they're kind of narrower. So they're narrower but more vertically extensive. And this is suggesting that the role of vertical accretion is greater than lateral accretion. So that's cool to see. Now, looking at the more distal deposits, and these would be distal kind of offshore, we're looking at lobe deposits now. So one of my motivations was how does onshore vegetation affect onshore stratigraphy? But one thing that's been really cool to see is how onshore vegetation is directly driving offshore um, stratigraphy. So remember how the vegetated delta was kind of rooting water and sediment past the kind of stable banks, building up those little bird's foot lobes, but restricting the migration of those lobes. The result of that is the kind of more localized offshore sedimentation, and we have these really well-defined lobe patches in the stratigraphy. So for our non-vegetated distal deposits, here you can almost see this like lobe that just swings all the way to the right. The blue is kind of nicely highlighting like the accretion surfaces. And then it runs out of space and then it turns back the other way and migrates that way. So these lobe deposits, they're really long relative to their height. So they have a really high aspect ratio. Whereas when we look down at our vegetated distal deposits, here we see that actually like there's a higher lobiness. And by that I mean, these lobe deposits, they're narrower relative to their height. So they have lower aspect ratios. So if we kind of compare them, there's a very obvious difference in lobe aspect ratio, which is something that we can potentially see in outcrop in the field. So is this stratigraphy reasonable? This is one question that I wanted to stop and think about because this was effectively a pilot study in using vegetation to build experimental stratigraphy. So one of the first things we wanted to do is think, okay, is this reasonable? Do we expect to see this? So thinking about those stable channel networks and those persistent floodplains, also thinking about the idea of the kind of restricted lobe migration, enhanced lobe definition, and more localized offshore sedimentation. How do we link those processes to the products that we see? And this is how we do it. So for those stable channel networks and those persistent floodplains, that is what driving the emphasis of vertical accretion in the vegetated delta stratigraphy. And that's what's driving the kind of clustering of channel deposits in space. When we think about the restricted lobe migration and enhanced lobe definition, that is directly translating to the geometries of the lobe stratigraphy. So for the vegetated delta, I wrote that wrong. For the vegetated delta, the lobes have lower aspect ratios. Another way we can think about is this stratigraphy reasonable is to compare it with modern analogs, with field analogs. And I just want to highlight this example. These are anastomose channels of the Upper Narew River in Poland. And these are effectively peatlands. And many researchers have worked on these. And one really cool thing that they found is that a lot of these channels in and among the peatlands, they're very narrow and they're very deep, but their channel floors have a lot of sediment. So these channels have very high channel floor aggradation rates. So when we take these kinds of observations, we think, okay, everything that we've seen in the stratigraphy is very reasonable. We're going to do more work to kind of compare them with stratigraphic examples and so on. But just to kind of summarize with some of the implications of what we found. So everything that I've observed from these experiments, how does that help us understand delta dynamics on intermediate to long time scales? So just some implications for predicting delta response to sea level rise. I can just kind of bring back this kind of plot of delta area and just this heat map of our shoreline contours through time. And we can start to think about how will deltas respond to sea level rise and to what extent will vegetation modulate this response? So we're seeing delta area change, but we can start to ask ourselves questions about how will the area change? So is vegetation, if we're thinking about vegetated shoreline roughness, are vegetated deltas, are we going to have more inland flooding happening more rapidly? How are these changes going to happen? And some of the insights that we can gain, we can transfer it to those questions. Another implication of these results is interpreting pre-vegetation Earth history. So just to pull an example from fluvial stratigraphy world. So in fluvial stratigraphy, we often find that when we're thinking of braided river deposits, our channel deposits are very long and narrow. If you have lots of threads reworking, you end up with these long, thin channel packages. And these are often amalgamated. Whereas when you think of meandering river deposits, the typical fascies model is that we have this long and thin deposit that's kind of with this emphasis of lateral accretion, and it's surrounded by overbank. Now, a lot of people have worked on pre-vegetation stratigraphy, and most observations of pre-vegetation rivers have led to the interpretation that those rivers were sheet braided. But there's increasing awareness that, hang on, like, did we need, let me rephrase this. So the idea is that in pre-vegetation world, you had a lot of sheep-braided rivers, and that the evolution of land plants in the Ordovician, Silurian, that provided cohesion that was needed to stabilize banks, channelize, and generate these kind of single-thread meandering rivers. So when we look at the pre-vegetation rock record, everything looks like a sheep-braided river. But the question that we're kind of getting at is, were these sheep-braided rivers? Do we know what pre-vegetation single-thread versus multi-thread rivers should look like? How do we take fascies models that are based and developed on vegetated systems? How do we apply those to pre-vegetation, the pre-vegetation rock record? And just to bring up this panel again, if this is a proximal region of the non-vegetated delta. If we kind of took this kind of broad, if you were looking at a cliff in the field and you saw all this blue overbank and these like long and thin isolated channel bodies surrounded by overbank, you might think, oh, this is like a happily like single thread meandering river in like a vegetated setting. But what we're seeing here is actually a non-vegetated channel can produce something very similar. So one thing that I'm going to do is I analyze these and I'm going to pull out channel body aspect ratios, various channel clustering metrics, channel aggradation indexes, lobe aspect ratios, and so on, dimensionless metrics that we could potentially pull out and upscale to stratigraphy and help use to try and figure out what we're looking at, what we're trying to interpret when we're looking at the pre-vegetation rock record. And a final implication, so what are the implications of these results for interpreting the origin of fan-shaped landforms on planetary surfaces? So again, these shoreline contours, we can leverage observations of our non-vegetated shoreline evolution to help determine the origins of fan-shaped landforms on the planets. But the vegetated delta observations, they're not totally useless. Vegetation is a source of cohesion, so we can also leverage the differences between our non-vegetated and vegetated delta shoreline evolution. We can take those differences and use them to potentially infer the sediment cohesion conditions when we're looking at fan-shaped landforms on other planets. So just to give some take-home points, this is still work in progress. So I'm welcome to any suggestions or ideas that you have. So the take-home so far is that non-vegetated and vegetated deltas are distinct, both on their surfaces and in their stratigraphy. And vegetation promotes rough shorelines that evolve by thinking of those kind of high amplitude, longer wavelength fluctuations. So we think they evolve by these less frequent, slower, larger scale adjustments. We find that vegetation fixes channel networks, localizing turnover and doubling floodplain residence times. At the shoreline, vegetation is restricting lobe migration, localizing that offshore sedimentation, which means that in our vegetated delta deposits, these deposits are characterized by, in the proximal areas, clustered channels with high vertical accretion rates, but in more distal offshore areas, lobe deposits with low aspect ratios. So I will finish it there, and I just want to thank everyone in this box for all of their help on my journey to do experiments. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sinead, for this wonderful talk. Yeah, I mean, I really like this studio setting. Looks very professional, and as a studio as well. So before anyone asks
Very
a
DIY.
question,
Those are rain gutters from Home
wow,
Depot.
haha, yeah, it's a super cool DIY setting. Yeah, let's see whether any question from the chat. Maybe before that, I can ask a question. So what's your next plan? Do you plan to run even longer simulation experiments? Because I mean, when I look at this, I see there's a lot of things can be done, like migration timescale, avulsion timescale, reworking timescale, even compensational timescale. I think this is a perfect place to test, how these timescales influence each other with vegetation, without vegetation. Yes, I think this is a really heated topic. Could you say something about this?
Yeah, so most of my work so far has been focused on surface observations. So my next step is like I'm getting into the more formal stratigraphic observations now. So a lot of the mapping of channel deposits, lobe deposits, pulling out their geometries, um, looking at spatial statistics, get at clustering. But I'm still doing things with the surface observations. So I would love to be able to calculate avulsion timescales and so on. But one of the challenges I've had is generating the channel network masks. They're very noisy because of the vegetation and bits of glare. They get a little bit fragmented. So currently, I want to be cautious with how I use and interpret them, which is why I focused on looking at broad patterns of channel visitation, channel turnover, channel persistence. Um, to formally kind of like get it, then like network branching and avulsion, I need really like fixed channel networks with like no little gaps or anything. And I have tried so many methods to threshold these masks to get really good channel networks. But I think ultimately I'm going to have to manually hand draw them. So I'm going to slowly make manual masks of the actual networks. And then once I've done that, that opens doors to thinking about what is the kind of stream order? How do channels move? How often? What are the timescales between abandonment and reoccupation? Um, there are other aspects of the surface that I'm still working on. So looking at the delta area throughout the experiment duration. Um, I want to look at what portion of that delta area loss is due to auto retreat, um, and pull in observations of delta slopes. So throughout the experiment, we also stopped every 2 hours to take photos around the delta for photogrammetry to generate models of the delta top set. So I want to take those delta area observations, calculate the portion of loss due to auto retreat, but then also like link the actual loss that we see with the slopes that are happening on the surface. So yeah, still a lot more to do.
I also have a question, maybe. Like in the graph where you see the area that is decreasing with time, I mean, like with the different experiments, you have like this linear trend with the vegetated delta, and you have like this kind of curvy trend for the non-vegetated area. Do you know, like, it seems there's some kind of point at which like the slope is changing. Do you know what it is due? Like, what kind of process is happening?
So that is, we haven't fully explored that. So there's a couple of, so just with that long-term delta area trend, I think I mentioned earlier, there were like a couple of hours in there where the area wasn't quite right. And that's just kind of from when we're making the masks of the delta area, we're pulling out different color channels and we're assigning global thresholds to separate land and water. So there's a couple of hours where I need to go back and use a better threshold. Um, but the plan is once I'm happy with the full mask set, to kind of more formally analyze that decline. I'm going to smooth out some of the noise, just kind of, I mean, the plot that I showed you was just the delta area through time, but just to kind of smooth out some of the noise, just try fitting different moving averages, just to kind of help make any trend a little bit clearer without focusing on small scale irregularities that are probably mask artifacts, but just trying to get at that difference that maybe I can go back. I think I had that. Yeah. So trying to, I mean, we can kind of see for the non-vegetated one, you can see that you can kind of track that loss quite quickly. To try and formally compare it or like find the threshold at which the difference is, I don't quite know how I would do that. I think I want to have my slope data as well. And have that on the same graph because that might help. Like, is there something changing in the slope of these two deltas? Perhaps the slope change is following the delta area change. Who knows? I don't have enough to say from this plot alone about any particular threshold, but with more information, I would know. My main guess is that for the vegetated delta, the area loss is slower because the delta is more efficiently moving sediment to the shoreline. So modeling experiments have shown kind of, non-vegetated deltas tend to be steeper, whereas vegetated deltas, you have like a low sloping region at the shoreline, which kind of helps to preserve that area. So it could be the role of that with if the vegetated delta is more efficiently getting sediment to the shoreline, it's slowing down that area loss. That area loss that seems to be happening more quickly on the non-vegetated delta. But yeah, it's too soon to know for sure.
Okay, for sure. Thanks.
Thanks, Sinead. There's a question in the chat, and I have a few questions if we have time. So this is Colleen, and it says, thank you, Sinead, for this great talk. These are very exciting results. I'm not familiar with experiment setups, but could there be an influence of the size of the sediment you put in your basin? What was your decision process to choose the grain size?
Yeah, so the influence of the size of sediment. So one thing we always have to remember with these experiments is that they're riddled with scaling issues. If you think of the sediment that I was using a mixture of fine sand, fine to medium sand, and coarse sand, but my delta is tiny. So when you think of an actual delta, it's almost like I've made a delta with boulders the size of houses. So we often have, I say we often, all physical experiments, they all have scaling issues, and researchers will try and do X, Y, and Z to kind of minimize the impact of those scaling relations. So in some experiments, people won't use mud because they don't want mud on the channel floor to like promoting laminar flow. So there's lots of things that people do. So on one end, you can do everything you can to try and hydrodynamically scale it, but on the other end, you can just leave it and accept that it's an experimental delta. It can never be directly compared with a real delta. And there's a lot of work to show that even with these scaling issues, everything that we observe is very reasonable. Is that the Chris Paola paper, the unreasonable effectiveness of physical experiments. So with that in mind, like we were just thinking about what sediment size we're going to use. We decided to use a mix of fine and coarse. And the main reason we decided to use that is because I wanted to look at how deposits, what the stratigraphy looked like. If I just used fine sand, if I just had one grain size and it was fine sand, it would be really difficult in the stratigraphy to start picking out channel processes versus overbank processes. So by using a finer sand and a coarser sand, we can start to like just differentiate between potentially like the coarser channel deposits and the finer overbank deposits. So that was the reason I chose that. And I did that. It was 47.5% fine, 47.5% medium coarse. And then I added in 5% of bentonite clay. And the reason for doing that is because of the scaling issues, it's really hard to form channels in experiments. So researchers that do these kinds of experiments, they'll often add in like clays or various polymers that will kind of promote channelization. I didn't want to do that too much because ultimately I was interested in comparing the effects of vegetation being the source of cohesion. So I just did a little bit, but that was the process. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a question. I know very little about deltas, but I remember a talk about deltas that like the message I took with me was the sea level rise. If there is a constant sea level rise, the delta kind of advance to this, like, to seaward. But if there is an increase in sea level rise, the delta kind of like evolves a lot. But there were no vegetation comments about that. So I was wondering if with your results, we see this more avulsion frequency or more migration in the non-vegetated delta, but you were simulating a constant sea level rise. So maybe like how these differences how can you get similar results with different conditions? That's like my question. I don't know, it's too clear, but
Yeah, so yes, I guess you're getting at the kind of the role of the delta prograding
yes.
versus aggrading. And yeah, so there's this very fine balance between progradation and aggradation. And in theory, if your delta is kind of equilibrated to the sea level rise, it's going to aggrade keeping pace with sea level rise. So the kind of the delta area loss that I saw, no, it wasn't perfectly in balance at the start of the experiment, and it reached that equilibrium later on. So at the start of the experiment, as sea level rose, the delta area got smaller. So it's kind of aggrading, like shorelines are getting like the distal edges are getting drowned. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done to explore the impacts of that sea level rise on what's happening on the surface. I think the work that you're discussing, I think is it the work about it's like avulsion frequency increasing with sea level rise. Um, yeah, so one thing that I'm interested in is whether vegetation like moderates that potential increase in avulsion frequency with sea level rise. Kind of going back to my answer to Yue's question, where it's like I need like really good channel network masks to be able to do that. Currently they're a little bit too scattered with like pixels missing and little rogue pixels, such that I can't fully delineate the network in like one connected continuous mask. But once I have that, I could then compare the differences between the vegetated and non-vegetated in terms of the relative avulsion frequency. Um, the other interesting aspect was, so yeah, this was a constant sea level rise, but you may want to explore accelerating sea level rise, so on. So Kyle Straub's group at Tulane has done a lot of work for non-vegetated deltas, looking at how the delta processes change with changing sea level rise rates and also sea level fall, I think they did. But yeah, there's a lot that can be done. It's difficult to do with the kind of length of time it takes to run these experiments. So this ran over 2 months. It was only 60 hours, but it took 2 months because I had to stop and allow vegetation to grow every time. So there's a lot more to be done. But yeah, it would be really cool to see. I guess that's one of the implications I think about. If we expect avulsion frequency to increase with sea level rise, will vegetation slow that increase or dampen that increase?
Thank you. Really exciting.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I think we are quite good with time, and I don't see more questions in the chat. If there are no questions and okay for everyone, we are going to end this session. Yeah. I mean, thank you so much, Nate, for this fantastic talk, and thank you for everyone to attend this talk. Okay, somebody just want to enter. Oh, it's too late. Yeah. Okay. So we don't have any session next week because of EGU. So see you all in 2 weeks. Yeah. Bye.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so